Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the next AI panel. We are running late because I had to first kick off the others from stage. You know, it's always like this if there's no break before. But since we have a very tight schedule, we'll start. So we are going to deal with AI governance and looking at the role of legislators, tech companies, and maybe most importantly, standard bodies. This is the panel of the University of Luxembourg. I'm happy to introduce it as chair. My name is Mark Cole. I happen to be a professor in Luxembourg for media law, but I also chair the Institute of European Media Law. And as that, I am here now. The University of Luxembourg has what we call an interdisciplinary center for security, reliability, and trust, basically in IT systems. And as that, we have been organizing now since the past 5 years at CPDB a panel. And as you will see in a moment from the biographies, our goal is to bring together law and IT people on the same panel to see how we can approach important data protection issues from both angles. Now, this interdisciplinary approach is nothing unusual at CPDB, but outside of this conference, very often you have the problem that lawyers speak and computer scientists speak, but they don't speak together, and that's the idea of both the center and this panel. I'm very happy to have a list of very experienced experts to introduce. I'll do it briefly, and I'll do it in the order of how they were present in a moment. Christian Wagner is Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham for Computer Science, and he directs a lab for uncertainty in data and decision-making. So basically, he looks at how to clean up data when they come from many different sources, and as you will see, that has a lot of impact into AI. He will give an introductory overview of how to untangle AI. Next will be Alain Herman. He's an IT expert at the National Data Protection Authority of Luxembourg, the CNPD. We started out this panel as a cooperation with CNPD because we said it's important not only to have an academic discussion, but also see what is happening on the front. What are the authorities doing? And I'm very happy that every year we have an expert from CNPD speaking. He heads the certification unit and the data breach unit. So AI, as he will tell us, is not the everyday work of a data protection authority, but it's impacting, and it'll be interesting to hear his take. After that, Jan Schallerböck will speak. Some of you may know him from his earlier life when he was at the ULD, the Data Protection Authority of one of the German Länder, Schleswig-Holstein. Marit Hansen very frequently speaks here. He is now a lawyer at iRights, which is a law firm which, without having a trademark dispute with Apple, has called themselves iRights and deals with privacy practice every day. But he's also a chair in one of the ISO standardization bodies, and that's one of the reasons as well why we invited him today. Finally, Jana Lingenfelder is from IBM Germany. She is one of the technical relations executives there. And most importantly for our today's panel, she has been asked to convene a working group at ISO to find out between the existing ISO standardization bodies, one of them being governance implications of AI, and one of them being artificial intelligence, how what has been done so far can be used to govern AI in future. And so she will conclude with the presentation before we then open up discussion. And the discussion will be expertly led by Eric Valgueren. I think I don't have to introduce him to many of you, but for those of you that don't know him yet, he's partner at Stibbe Law Firm here in Brussels since ever, I would say, since 2001. Also, Stibbe has been supporting the CPDB from the very beginning, when CPDB conference was a 150-person group meeting in a small hall somewhere else in Brussels. And if I would have to characterize him in one sentence, I would say if I have a legal problem with technology, media, IT, infrastructure, he's the lawyer I would go to. Apart from that, he's also very interested in academia. He teaches, between many other things, at the Space, Communication and Media Law Master in Luxembourg. That's how I got to know him very well, and I'm very happy that he will take over. Eric, you have the chair now.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your kind words and for your introduction. In this panel, we will talk about governance of artificial intelligence. When I come across the word governance, I always ask myself, what does that really mean? Because it's a very vague concept. It's a fluffy term, and it's often used by people who don't really are sure what they are actually describing. Interestingly, we had this morning at 8:45, for those who were already in at that time, in the same room, a panel discussion about AI and regulation. Now, obviously here, when we talk about governance, we kind of widen up the topic because we all kind of sense that regulation could and should be part of that debate, but it's about much more than the question of regulation. What are we then discussing? We're discussing AI as a phenomenon and AI in terms of the challenges, risks it poses to society at large. And if we want to be serious about taking AI forward, then questions arise as to how we will kind of create an appropriate framework to do that. And I intentionally say framework without adding before that the word legal, because then again we narrow it down. A lot of questions arise then. Who should actually govern artificial intelligence? Should it be humans, or should it be more algorithms and computers? What is it that we actually want to govern? Do we want to govern the technology? Do we want to govern the input into artificial intelligence, like the data? Do we want to govern the algorithms themselves? Do we want to govern the output and the use made of artificial intelligence? Which triggers more questions as to whom it is that we want to govern. Do we want to focus on the users? Do we want to focus on the technology providers? Do we want to focus on the distributors, the platforms? A lot of questions there. Also in terms of possibilities to actually govern in a holistic way, how can we achieve that? Can we actually have a governance mechanism that is sufficiently technology neutral so that we actually have a sustainable model of governance? And what should be the building blocks of our governance? I already mentioned the possibility of including regulation. What is the room for policy makers? What is the room for ethics in all of that? And what is the room for standardization? Standardization, at a technical level, or again, standardization at a more ethical level. We can actually kind of deal with all these questions in a rather complete way, given the impressive lineup of speakers and panelists that we prepared today. We will kick off with Christian Wagner, who will actually start with a few fundamental concepts, also going into the question, what is artificial intelligence and to what extent do we think there are drivers and foundations that would kind of determine the case for governance. So he will kick off, and he will then be followed by Alain, who will present the perspective of the regulator. As introduced by Mark, Alain is with the CNPD, so the DPA in Luxembourg, and they definitely have some views on that. And Alain will actually present a little bit of a multi-layered approach to the governance question. And then we will move on with Jan. Jan will take us to what I would call the Bermuda Triangle of governance, where we actually have a number of tension fields that play out in the question, what is effective and efficient governance? In particular, Jan will actually distinguish the role of policymakers on the one hand and the role of standardization or standard-setting organizations. And then we will top things off with Jana, who, based on her background and her role, will take a deep dive into the potential of standardization in a governance model for artificial intelligence. We will try and stick to kind of rather short presentations from our different panelists, and with Mark, I will enforce that so that there will be ample room for you in the audience to respond. So that being said, I want to just kick off and give the floor to Christian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Eric. And thank you very much to the organizers for having me at the panel. When they asked me first to attend the panel, my initial reaction was, I know nothing about governance. And so they convinced me by telling me, but maybe you know something about AI. So I'll try and talk a little bit about that. So the first thing when thinking about AI is there's a need to untangle what we actually mean. What are we talking about? So if we can have the slides. So in a quick presentation, I'll talk about a I'll give a very brief background on where I come from. If you like, I'll self-declare what we do at Lucid. I'll give a high-level view of what it means or what we mean by AI, and I'll do a quick attempt at untangling it before giving a summary. So just as a brief background, what do we do? In terms of AI, we work with a variety of technologies. We work in some main areas. We work in environmental management, cybersecurity, fast-moving consumer goods, manufacturing. And in that space, we focus largely on uncertainty in data and how we capture it, how we manage it, how we analyze it. And we look at aspects such as interpretability of the AI that we generate. So for example, in the environmental management case, where you have what we would call heterogeneous data sources. So you have stakeholders who want some specific things from your management, but you also have environmental data, rainfall, salinity, etc. How do you develop AI that combines these data and then still allows decision makers to explain why they make the decisions based on the AI output that they are making? Very similar in cybersecurity, just that the emphasis is slightly different. Here we work a lot on how we can leverage the very limited insight of experts here, and I don't mean that their insight is limited, but just the number of experts is limited, facing a very large demand for the knowledge that does exist. And again, here we really focus on, if we have AI that leverages that insight and provides decision support outputs, how can experts make sure that these outputs are correct? How can they make sure that they make sense? So interpretability here again is key. And finally, in FMCG manufacturing, we focus specifically on things like consumer archetypes and how we can do inference and if you like, support product design based on AI using such algorithms. So I'll move on. So what do we mean by AI? Very often, we in the domain talk about AI as a black box. Here it's actually a blue box, but never mind. So I'll have a look at what are the things that are in the black box. So in the olden days, we would talk a lot about things like symbolic AI, such as rule-based systems, search, etc. So that's one type of AI. Much more recently, if you like, what causes all the rage is machine learning approaches, such as deep learning, etc. So another type of AI, if you like. And then finally, we all have heard about what we would call strong AI, i.e. human-level intelligence, potentially conscious levels of AI. So I think if we look at these three just as examples, in terms of symbolic AI, obviously this has been around for a very long time. There's potentially very little fuss at the moment around this type of AI, and I think it's interesting to ask why. I think it would take a little bit long to go into that here. I mean, one could just say that it's, well, because it wasn't very successful, and I think that's partially true. However, there was also interesting aspects, for example, in reproducing medical knowledge, which was actually very successful, but was not very well accepted, even though it was based on what we call causality rather than correlation. So we had rules, effectively, that said, well, if you have these symptoms, then you most likely have this disease. In machine learning now, what we're really looking at is computationally intensive statistics. And of course, that is oversimplifying the advances, but I think it summarizes it very well. And these statistics are all about the data. So that's where I feel the whole aspect of GDPR comes in. But on the other hand, if we think about governance of AI, are we saying we want governance of statistics? And, well, I don't think we do. So, and then finally, I think in terms of the strong AI, we can simply say, well, we're not there yet. Is it worth talking about? Is it worth discussing? Yes, of course it is. Are we at a point where governance is needed? Probably not. Maybe we should think about it, but it's probably not what we're really concerned about. So in that sense, I think the things on the left, really, the technologies, are what we're talking about when we're talking about governance for AI, why the AI vision, the idea of strong AI, is something that we can leave aside just for now. So moving on, I wanted to give one example of governance of AI technology. So before I said, is it all about governing statistics? Well, another take may be, no, it's all about governing the technologies that are based on AI. And I thought this is a really interesting one, where Brad Smith, the Microsoft president, about 6 months ago, put a blog on their website actually asking for more government oversight and more regulation in respect to face recognition. So I just highlighted a couple of things where he says, in part, this improvement reflects better cameras, sensors, and machine learning capabilities, so the rapid advance in facial recognition. And then at the end, he's asking, this, in fact, is what we believe is needed today, a government initiative to regulate the proper use of facial recognition technology, informed by an expert commission, etc. So here there's more of a take is we should regulate the technologies arising from AI. So I think the question then is, so is it all about regulating applications and services which use AI? Is that sufficient? So I think if we are to kind of get to that question, it's worth looking at why exactly do we want AI governance? Is it because we are concerned about applications and services which are underpinned by AI? And I would say yes. So there is robotics, computer vision, political advertising, etc. All of these are applications we're concerned about. However, are we also concerned about computationally intensive statistics on potentially large, potentially private, etc. data sets? And again, the question is probably yes. So we're worried about things like bias, we're worried about things like privacy, accuracy of the data, etc. And then finally, are we concerned about the how? So are we concerned about the properties of AI algorithms? So, for example, I put here machine learning identifies correlations within a sample. However, what we really want is we want causality in respect to the population, which is usually something we're not getting to. And so here we have properties of AI like explainability, verifiability, stability, which is a term from actually control theory, if you like, in robotics. Stability means that if a controller traditionally is stable, it means there will be no specific set of inputs for which it will, if you like, go crazy, potentially blow up your engine. The same really is needed for AI. You want to make sure that your AI is stable, that there is not a specific set of inputs which gives you an unexpected output. So I'll talk about each of these areas in a little bit more detail. So in terms of AI governance of applications and services, I think governance of applications, services enabled by AI, that is really not a question that is about AI. And actually, I think that's pretty much the same for other technologies or for many other technologies. If I just think of gene editing, nobody is really concerned about the actual tools of gene editing, how specifically CRISPR works, or even if you go and edit, I don't know, the genes of fruit flies. What people are really concerned about is editing the human genome. So there is a difference between the AI and the technologies. However, what is true about AI is that we have a rapidly growing set of new applications, and many of which are not really sufficiently discussed, and many of which will need oversight and potential governance. And I just put examples here from robotics. Autonomous cars obviously have been a lot in the news, but things like companion robots have barely been discussed and are rapidly being developed. Computer vision, like in the previous example, and targeted political advertising, which has obviously been in the news quite a lot. Talking about the actual governance on data, obviously AI runs on data, and GDPR addresses key aspects in respect to privacy. However, there's a whole lot of other facets in respect to data that are really important. So, for example, do we need regulation for requiring bias-free data sets? So that the data sets actually represent the target population, not the sample that the AI was trained on? Do we need standards for ensuring data quality and accuracy? Also, who earns knowledge gathered from a data set? And can data and AI-driven insights be decoupled and, for example, sold? And what labeling is then used for such AI products? For example, do we need data ingredients? Do we need to put information about whose data and what data was used in order to derive that knowledge? There's a lot of remaining questions. And then the last aspect in respect to algorithms. So in GDPR, it says one of the aspects in respect to automated decision-making meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and the envisaged consequences of such processing for the data subject, which I think sounds very reasonable. One of the things that I'm trying to learn much more about by coming to this conference is simple things like understanding what is actually meant by logic, because it's not clear to me. Does this mean giving people a vague explanation of the correlations that led to them not getting a loan? Or does this mean, you know, first order logic? Does it mean if this, then that? You know, you were in this category, that's why I didn't get a loan. And I think that makes a huge difference for the AI technology. And branching out a little bit from that, there is so many desirable properties, like I said before, the transparency, the stability, the robustness, etc. And I was going to use the platform for a plug just to point out that substantially more research here is needed. So one of the things we work on is how do we run algorithms on privacy-preserving interval-valued data, so if you don't have the specifics. And many of these questions, we just do not know the answers at the moment. So governance is important, but we also need governance that allows the room to grow for the AI technologies. So here's really where just a thought, being the uninformed in respect to governance, it feels that such properties are a question that may require involvement of professional bodies, standards, labeling, and of course, oversight. So just to conclude, I think it's really important to discuss and to be clear of what we mean by AI. So splitting it into core aspects may help to avoid that confusion, I tried going down here when doing this split, not down the splitting in respect to AI technologies, machine learning, rule-based systems, etc., but trying to go slightly higher level. I think by doing that, we can avoid confusion. So, for example, in the EC 2018 report on AI, which is great, but there are aspects such as ethical and secure by design algorithms are crucial to build trust in this disruptive technology. Where when I read it, the first thing that came to mind is algorithms will never be ethical. People are ethical or not. Secure by design, it will always depend on the data that you put in. There's a saying of not very good data in, not very good results out, not to use any swear words. So I think it's very important to be very clear about what do we mean when we say these things. Or are we talking about a conscious AI that should be just and ethical? And I think in that sense, that's very far in the future. So in practice, of course, also applications, data, and algorithms are not always clearly separable. But in respect to governance, there may be value in considering both the whole and the parts. And so finally, just a second plug that the EU is internationally ideally placed to prioritize and deliver the research advances in AI which match our key ethical priorities. I think it's fair to say that the heavyweights, mainly China and the US, for them, the ethical concerns around AI are not a priority. And we really are ideally placed to develop in this direction. So ideally, AI governance can be a first step to support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thanks for that lucid interval. We will immediately turn over to Alain and get the regulator's perspective. Go ahead.
May I have the presentation?
Right.
Okay. So I will give you a brief point of view of our DPA, the Luxembourgish DPA, about how we deal today with DPA, about how we could deal today with artificial intelligence processing. So firstly, if we have a look at what the requirements of the GDPR are that are contributing to the governance of artificial intelligence processing. First, you have the obligation of accountability. Of course, all the principles relating to personal data processing will also apply to AI processing as any other processing, with a more particular focus on transparency. Of course, all the rights of the data subjects have to be applied to the processing of AI processings, including requirements on automated decision about individuals. There's also the requirement to integrate all this processing with data protection by design, data protection by default. So all these elements are already some positive elements to contribute to the setup of a governance in the context of personal data processing and AI. On the top of that, probably that most or many of the AI-based processing will require a DPI-A to be performed. If we just have a quick look at the Article 29 guidelines about which potential criteria could trigger the obligation of a DPI-A, we have evolution or scoring, automated decision-making, legal effect or similar effect on data subjects, processing of sensitive data or data of highly personal nature, data processed on a larger scale. So this might be applied at almost any AI processing which is based on machine learning because it works better with a lot of data. Matching or combining data sets are also apply, and innovative use or applying new technology solution. So maybe we cannot consider AI as a new technology, it's quite old technology, but there is innovating use about it. So for many AI processing, probably that two or more of these criteria will apply for their processing. GDPR provides also some new tools, like the certification. So we could maybe see some certification schemes that will be developed that are focusing on AI processing in specific contexts, maybe. In these certification schemes, we could also have some specific criteria for the bodies who are going to certify to be able to know what AI technology is about. We could also see code of conducts which are dealing with the processing of AI processings in specific sectors. There will be development on frameworks, standards about how to applicate privacy by design into AI processing. We already do see some initiative here at the Luxembourg level. It's an example of the CSSF, which is the controller of the financial sector, who made quite a very good paper on artificial intelligence, opportunities, risk, and recommendations for the financial sector. It's written in English, so you can have a look at it also on their website. So they already give some advices about how to implement AI in this kind of processing. Then we also have, there was also a communication from the European Commission, it was on the spring last year, about the fact that the Commission will support national and EU-level consumer organization and data protection authorities in building an understanding of AI-powered application, and also with the help of the EDPB. So that said, there are already many elements that contribute to governance of AI and that would allow us to, let's say, do our job of controller of looking what's going on with that kind of processing. However, there are some limits. So the first limit that we identify today is our capacity to control up to a certain level these processings. Firstly, to be able to control that kind of processing, we need very specialized human resources. And that's something we don't have today. And I don't know if many authorities would have this kind of resources. Moreover, it could be very time-consuming to do control on this processing. And also, the controls that we do on this processing, that could be compliant with the regulation, but it wouldn't prevent negative impacts of this processing to the fundamental rights of the freedoms of the individuals. Because we will be able today to control how governance is set up, how the controllers are implementing all the means to answer to all the GDPR requirements. But what about understanding the algorithm of AI, for example? All the problematics that just my neighbor explained. That's another question. Also, there might raise some ethical problems raised through AI processing. So who decides if the processing is a risk for the rights and freedom of individuals? Is it the controller under its accountability responsibility? So there may be a problem of impartiality. Of course, the controller, his main goal is also to do business. Is it us, DPAs? But such decision might be out of scope of our powers. So we can identify processing that might impact that might impact the rights and freedoms of individuals, but not all. There might be some elements that we might even not have the right to decide about. So this might be handled on another societal level, and not just on the level of the DPA. So if you look at data protection and the transparency and all the accountability mechanisms and the requirements, so it's some step to go toward mitigating human rights abuses in the use of AI, but they are not enough to solve all the foreseeable problems. So there should be a multi-stakeholder and pluralistic approach so that most of the potential threats are identified and that the solution and the decisions that are made don't preference any specific group or further diminish marginalized voices. We can also see that in order to go to this direction, the International Conference of the Data Protection Commissioner have made a call for government governance principle on artificial intelligence to have a multi-stakeholder approach in order to address all these cross-sectorial issues, and that they also call to the fact that these governance principles must take place on an international level, since AI is a trans-border phenomenon and may affect all humanity. We also see now there was a document that was published, a draft document by the EU Commission in December from the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, and currently drafting ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI on which we can rely. So just to conclude, data protection plus accountability and transparency might help to mitigate worse use of AI processing, but there is more work is necessary to safeguard the rights and freedoms, as AI is more and more complex, sophisticated, and it's expanding in new areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain. So next we will move to Jan, who will give his views on how to deal with the, as I called it, the governance Bermuda Triangle.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you all for having me. It's always great to be at CPDP. I like this conference very much. Let me first say that I'm by no means an expert in AI technologies. The closest I will come to this is by birth, because my father is a mathematician and a doctor of philosophy by training and spent most of his time looking at numbers and developing statistics. Who was at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week? Well, me neither, as most of you. But rumor has it that George Soros said, I want to use my time tonight to warn the world about an unprecedented danger that's threatening the very survival of open societies. It may not come to you as a surprise, he was talking about AI. Personal story here, I've hinted at the problems for democracy with manipulation through the AI as early as 2008, so I might be a bit biased as to what problems to look at in this context. But then again, it may not just be me. If we look at the topics of this year's CPDP, 845, privacy impact assessment, and democracy, safeguarding voter data. Micro-targeting, and computational propaganda, privacy, and democracy. Influence or manipulation, what protects in the digital world. Data is political power. I mean, you might see an underlining theme here, and if you look at the title of this year's CPDP, it's Data Protection and Democracy. Now, finally, and this is where I have to slightly object to Alain's excellent presentation, there was the topic, regulation, artificial intelligence, is the GDPR enough? And the answer is no, it's not. And if I say so, at CPDP, as a privacy lawyer, I would probably be looked at because this must be blasphemy. But really, the answer is no. GDPR is not enough because of two main reasons. First of all, in AI, we often don't have to do with personal identifiable information or personal data as the GDPR poses it. The identifiability is not important for training the AI. The other problem is that GDPR regulation is ultimately geared at protecting the rights and freedoms of the individual, but not geared to protect the democracy. But the problem is even more complex, and if you read the whole speech by George Soros, you will understand that even if we were to tackle the problem in the EU, there might be other regimes who might have a relevant advantage by not putting in any restrictions on AI. So given this outlook, it might be a good idea to get ready for the next AI winter. This time it's not because it's getting cold for AI, but it might be getting colder in societies because of AI. Well, of course, I'm not going to end with such a pessimistic outlook. An intensive discussion is underway, and that is our best mechanism as an inclusive and open society. We can discuss these things and we can develop strategies. And as Alan already mentioned, there is a high-level expert group on artificial intelligence comprised of 52 mostly very distinguished persons from different fields. And they just issued the draft ethics guidelines on trustworthy AI and is inviting comments. And this is what I want to do with the rest of my talk. For this discussion, here are 3 contributions. The first problem, or the first item, is we need to concentrate our discussion on the specific problems induced by AI. And from deferring from my talk until now, you could probably see what I think is the most important and most pressing problem. Unfortunately, the report doesn't reflect it. It's indeed very high level. Next on the list is the term of AI. And there is definitions in the document, and there is a reference to an external document that elaborates a little bit more on the term, but I couldn't find that document. It's nowhere to be found. In the definitions, let me first of all say that I think for our discussion, the term AI is highly misleading. It is a well-established term in a specific technical space. It's a terminus technicus, which is totally fine, but it's not suited very well to make the social discussion, the policy discussion that is needed in this space, because it raises all kinds of connotations. When you look at or think about AI, you think of androids taking over the world, etc., which could also be abbreviated strong AI. And I think there's other topics to be concerned with than such futuristic outlooks. It's just nice to have and read science fiction, but right now we have pressing problems in our democracies. The group might acknowledge this, but in their definitions, I couldn't infer that problem. And next, if we look more closely into the definitions, I want to highlight one term. They define AI as machines or systems reasoning on the knowledge derived from data. And I, again, find this very misleading. Look into the technologies, and Christian has already pointed out, when we're talking about AI, we're mostly talking about deep learning and reinforcement learning. And if we're talking about these technologies, reasoning is the last the machine does. Quite the opposite. We spend a lot of research capacity currently trying to then reason afterwards why the machine has come to a certain conclusion. And of course, I'm by no means an expert, but I read into the results and the papers of the 2017 conference, the IJCAI conference, quickly for preparing for this workshop, which was on explainable artificial intelligence. And if you look at all these technologies, as the uninaugurated gets one impression. And it seems to me that a lot of people are trying to solve the problem in a way that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What they're describing is, because of the complexity of explaining the AI decisions, they are now using AI to provide reasons to the user and measure the reasons or the results as how well the user likes that. So, for example, you could be recommended to buy something at an online shop. And the underlying optimization is probably geared to selling as much as possible. the user would probably want to know why he was recommended a certain product, and then if he is asking that question, the reason he will be given is not the complexities that led eventually to that recommendation, but the reason is because other people have bought the similar product. And the user then will be satisfied. Admittedly, there is a lot of research going on in that field, and I've deferred this kind of cynic viewpoint from one of the papers. But there's many other looks into that, but we can take one conclusion away. Reasoning is certainly not a strong point of artificial intelligences. To sum up, to come to a good governance, we need to address concrete problems, define concrete technologies, and do not use blurry definitions. So how we go about? Well, the governance process in an ideal world is where policymakers should make rules which are technology neutral, and standardization should not approach the policy space, but helping implementing those rules. Well, I'm sorry to break it to you, but we do not live in such an ideal world, really. Lawmakers, as we've just seen, are often challenged with addressing current problems in technology due to the enormous dynamics and complexities, and often only come to a formal compromise which lacks sufficient content. Therefore, in recent years, we have seen standardization bodies and sometimes companies filling that space. And I believe we have to acknowledge that, and maybe this yields also some adjustments in different standardization forums to accept and acknowledge that effectively we're dealing in a space where we're taking on roles of policymakers. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to Jana, who is working in SC42, and everybody who's read The Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy knows that 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Thank you very much.
Excellent, well done, Jan, and thanks for making my life easier because you already provided the perfect transition into Jana's speech. So, Jana, please go ahead.
Good morning. It's good morning. It's still good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me for this talk. The purpose of my presentation will be to give you an overview in what is happening now with respect to governance of AI in organization within standardization world, specifically in JTC1. First of all, I would like to show you the structure. Can I? Yeah. Okay. The next.
Green.
Green is the next, and back is. Okay. Thank you. That is the structure. First of all, I'd like to show you where the group that is working on this project is. We have two international organizations, ISO, International Organization Standardization, and IC, International Electrotechnical Commission. Each of these organizations have technical committees, and they have also one common child, which is JTC1. JTC1 works on the area of standardization, on the information communication technology standardization. And there is a technical committee which is at the same time child of ISO and IC. JTC1 itself consists of several SCs and working groups. And one and two of these SCs subcommittee is SC40, which is IT Services Management and IT Governance, and SC42, Artificial Intelligence. So as you can see, there can be working groups within JTC1, but there are usually working groups within SC. This working group, which is called Governance Implications of AI, is a child of two SCs, SC40 and SC42. So which means this area is relevant, or both of these areas, artificial intelligence and IT service management and IT governance, are relevant for standardization and governance implication of AI. Specifically, so I'm the convener of this group, and this project this group is mandated to work on standardization project governance implications of the use of artificial intelligence by organizations. Project has started in end of November, and it is scheduled for 36 months, which means we will have a standard published about in 3 years. The work has just started. We have only one e-committee meeting of the group. The purpose of the project, the scope of the project is providing guidance for governing bodies on the effective, efficient, and acceptable use of AI in their organization, providing a framework for understanding the implications of the use of AI technologies, and providing guidance for wider communities, which can be external businesses, public authorities, auditors, and others. What I'd like to emphasize at this point is these standards doesn't copes only with governance of AI within organizations. It is not about external governance of AI from external bodies. It is about governance of AI within organizations. That is guidance for governing bodies, for managers, upper level management, middle management of the organization, how to use the AI. Standards is being created from scratch, but it is of course not in the empty space. There are already many different documents and already published standards and technical reports that are related for this project. So you can see the first 4 items. These are deliverables, technical specification, technical report, and international standards that came from Subcommittee 40, so governance of IT. And there are also two next documents. There are working drafts which are now being developed in SC42, in Artificial Intelligence Group. I'd like to draw your attention to the document Artificial Intelligence Concepts and Terminology. Jan already mentioned the definition of AI, and this project will need, each standardization project is based on definitions, and this specific working draft, Artificial Intelligence Concepts and Terminology, should define terms relevant for AI. Our project in the joint working group will reference this project. We will need the definitions that are already defined in this project 22989. Also, the definition of AI is being agreed now by the experts within this project 22989. But there are more definitions, machine learning, and so on and so on. So every term that we use, it should be agreed on by experts, and later on in the later stages of standardization by national bodies. Why this international standard is needed? As I already said, this standard creates a common language by well-defined terms relevant for governance of AI. These standards will also create framework to address implications for governance arising from specific AI technologies. For whom it is relevant? It is relevant for companies that develop AI systems, for companies that use AI systems, and for wider community. So there are a lot of experts in the group who come from different countries, from different companies, from different organizations, not only private companies, with very different backgrounds. And all this expertise flow now in this, or start flowing and will be part of this project. So it is very important that we have all this work based on the very diverse and very broad expertise of the area. And what this standard will also create is a common international view on governance of AI in organizations. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jana, and thanks to all of you for keeping so meticulously to time, so we have room for discussion. to get a view of on what the sense of the audience is for questions, can you just raise a hand, those who would like to ask a question, so I can kind of estimate the time and use of time? At least one question we have. Okay, good. I may have a question myself listening to our different contributors, and then obviously we will turn to the audience. Maybe as a first question to Christian, beginning with you. You actually mentioned one of the buzzwords when you spoke, meaning you used the word black box in terms of artificial intelligence, which is kind of a concern that is often raised. My question to you is, what role should governance play vis-a-vis that kind of common perception that it's all a black box? I mean, should governance lead to breaking up those black boxes in your view?
I think it's a difficult question, because I think actually the two parts of the question, at least from my background from a computer science point of view, are not compatible. So the reason that we talk about black box AI is because it is AI which, for example, in the case of machine learning, if you think about deep learning, is based about extracting knowledge based on correlation, potentially on large data sets. Now, that knowledge is then, if you like, present in a big network. However, that network is not easily scrutable by humans. So this is interesting because Jan, for example, mentioned a bit about AI is not good at reasoning, and I think we could probably have another panel on what we mean by reasoning. But to get back to your question, I don't think you can, well, obviously you can mandate that all AI should be white box AI. So for example, a rule-based system. However, to take the simple view, all the recent boom in AI, the boom in machine learning, that has made a lot of money, that has made it very difficult for computer science departments to retain all their talent because the Microsofts, the IBMs, and the Googles are busy buying it. That has largely been delivered by black box AI. So yes, at the moment there is efforts of making the black box grayer, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Okay. I was also triggered by another point you raised in terms of what should be regulated, and you made, I think, the distinction between the technology itself and the applications. My question there is, will we ever be able to kind of regulate or govern the applications, because there seems to be a constant stream of new applications, and will we ever have a sustainable model of governance that would focus on the applications rather than on the technology?
I think to answer that question properly, I would need to know more about governance than I do. But I think the one point that I can answer is, like I was trying to make the point before, it's really important to tease these two things apart. If you take any technology, if you take drones, for example, or take computer vision, to stick with the Microsoft example, it's an application. Now there is, can the government track citizens and authenticate who they are at all the time? That's a privacy concern. And I think we can have governance for that. However, that is completely different to governance for algorithms. So for example, if we use a specific algorithm to actually enable that technology, do we have criteria on? Does it need to be public about what sample, so what is the data set that algorithm was trained on? Right. Because it's not going to be trained on the population. Does that need to be public? Those are things we can, I think, regulate, or we can put governance in place, but that then focuses much more on governance of the algorithm rather than the application. So I think both is needed, but they should be separate in my view.
Right. Okay. Maybe briefly turning to Alain, who presented, I think, a model or an approach to governance relating to focusing on a multi-stakeholder and a pluralistic approach, which I think is a very interesting concept. I think the question I have for Alain is, how do we avoid fragmentation? How do we make sure that if we actually set up governance that we avoid fragmentation, especially if you also involve DPAs? The question is, how can we have some kind of holistic approach? Do you have any thoughts on that, Alain?
Difficult question too. Of of course, we have to work together, not only DPA on one side, working expert groups on other sides, standardization on other sides. We have to find a way to work together and to set up this multi-layer governance together.
Okay. Because it was also triggered by the fact...
And I think we don't even ourselves, we don't have the power, even maybe the rights to make decisions that are broader than what we can make decisions for. So for us, it's limited to data protection, to control impact on rights and freedoms of individuals in the context of data protection. But as we see, AI problematic is much more broader than just this one, even in case of processing of personal data.
Okay. Jan, you made a strong case for, I think, the separation between the role of policymakers on the one hand, and on the other hand, the standardization organizations. Does it mean there should be no interfacing or interconnection between these two poles?
Well, usually there isn't much, actually, except for maybe that there's actors within the standardization space that will be sent by policymakers or so. But other than that, the ideal conceptualization is that you have regulatory frameworks which provide requirements, and then these are boiled down into technical terms in the standardization bodies. And often now we are having these troubles with not getting clear enough instructions kind of from the lawmakers. So we're always bugged with questions that go deep into the policy space, and this is very difficult. If you look at how standardization works, it's usually consent-based, so everybody has to agree, right. Which is not something you have in the political world. Within the specific organizations, we have also different problems. I've been involved with ISO standardization for more than a decade now, and I'm very pleased now to be appointed chair for a group on privacy by design for consumer protection. However, ISO standards are really expensive for consumers. $150 and more is just too much to just look into a document really quick and look whether it's applicable. And the whole process itself is not very transparent to the outsider. It's very hard to look what is going on as debates, as exchanges. Although it's well documented and gets a lot of legitimacy through the process, this is not made public, and that's another requirement for doing policy work, because we're then suddenly in the political world.
Okay. Maybe Anna, from your side, I think you made the case for standardization of AI and the specific groups working on it. The question I have for you is, I think all agree it took 4 years to get to GDPR, and we recognize that AI and GDPR are not a perfect match. Do you think through standardization we will go quicker and we will have a better process in terms of setting governance to something like AI? Sorry.
It's a difficult question whether we go further. So the role of standardization in the first line is not create regulations. It works the other way. Yeah. So if the regulation or if the government bodies or regulators need standardization to support the regulations, they create mandates. They ask standardization body to create this regulation. Now the creation of this group is not based on the fact that somebody needs regulations. So there is a market need for this kind of standard, and there is a recognized market need, and based on this market need, this standard is being created.
Okay, great. Now, opening up to the audience, we had the lady over there. Wait, sorry, I just wanted to reward the lady who was so courageous to put up her hand first. Go ahead.
I'm Jen Person from Defend Digital Me, a civil society organisation in England that campaigns for safe, fair and transparent data in education. My question relates to the question that Shoshana Zuboff asked last night. Who decides who decides? The governance, we talk around the standards a lot. We don't talk about much of the governance of the governing bodies who are deciding the standards. What do you think they should look like when most of the bodies that we have today, and increasingly certainly in England, the same companies that shape the future of AI are sitting on the governance bodies that are shaping the ethics and the governance around it? And most crucially, would you see a requirement for the bodies to also make a position of when should we not use AI, when it may not be in those companies' future interests to take that position?
Okay. Who would pick up that question? Jan, is that one for you?
Happy to take that. Thank you very much. Excellent question. I like that. First of all, we have to acknowledge that standards bodies weren't supposed to be doing these kinds of more regulatory approaches, and they're not set up to do that. And that exactly, the fact leads to these problems that I've just explained. If we acknowledge that standards bodies are increasingly going into the policy space, and I'm not suggesting they should, but if we're acknowledging that, then we need to reconsider the standardization process and be more transparent about it, and also be more inclusive. However, in ISO, for example, there is mechanisms to include consumer protection groups, and there is mechanisms to include academia as well. But you're absolutely right. It's mostly an industry-sponsored experience. Yeah, I think that should answer it.
Please, we'll have the gentleman over there.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Ulrich Salderslechts. I'm from ELSEC and the Privacy Salon. 2 questions, comments, if you like. The first one was maybe pointed to Christian. Maybe one consideration I would add to your excellent overview of potential challenges is something that when talking to people that are working in AI is something that they see coming up quite quickly, and that is that the devices themselves are thinking, so that you can have the additional layer of AI, namely that the devices themselves become artificially intelligent, which is typically a thing that we as humans don't have under control anymore. So I think that part of governance is something which is much more scary, at least to me, maybe to many of us, because of the 3 major topics that you talked about is probably something that we can somehow get under control in this reflection. But it's really the type of things that we cannot imagine that could happen thanks to those machines and their artificial intelligence capabilities we can get under control. The second is maybe a question to Jan and Jana, if you like. One legislation or governance body that I would suggest as well to consider in this case is organizations such as ENISA. I'm just mentioning such as because in the US there's also NIST in a similar perspective. In ENISA now, thanks to the Cyber Act, ENISA will have the governing role to do certification for IoT capabilities. And within most of the IoT developments, industrial IoT, there will be analytics already standard enclosed. So there's maybe some opening there to include it in that space as well. But okay, your comments.
Christian, you want to take the first part?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a really interesting point. So basically the question was around the risks or challenges in terms of distributed AI. So it's kind of like the Internet of Things, and as more AI goes to the distributed devices. And I have to say, I kind of see the concern, but I would actually stress the reverse is also true. The first thing is, what are we talking about again in terms of AI? Are we talking about, little AIs that are nearly at a sentient level and could become, make decisions, etc., which would be, we're not there yet. If we boil it down to the machine learning side, there's actually a lot of momentum to push more AI, more machine learning, and to distribute it down to consumers to preserve privacy. So again, we will have a need for standards and for oversight, and I think there's real concern about what is the data that is sent back from these distributed devices, from our smart TVs, etc. So I think there is an interesting need for governance. But actually, for example, rather than sending, if we think smart meters, in the beginning when smart meters were the big idea, research immediately latched on to, okay, we can actually split up the energy signal from each house and find out what device is being used and potentially by whom, etc. And it would be a huge invasion of privacy. Well, now the drive really is to aggregate locally to have some machine learning locally that then only passes on its statistical insights. Actually, I would say there's also a really positive side to it, not just a negative. I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay. Well, Jan, maybe...
More later.
Sorry, but in light of time, Jan, very briefly on the ENISA potential, and then we'll have one more question from the gentleman over there and closing remarks by Mark.
Okay. Well, you're absolutely right. ENISA is very well geared to do that, as are DPAs. But there is a lot of space for these organizations, but often then they later on will contribute to ISO standards because they're a more global endeavor.
Okay, great.
Just want to add that the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, will also have a role to play in this space and will be a counterpart for...
Exactly. Thank you very much, Alain. Sir.
So the question is related to the presentation by Professor Herman. And the question concerns two concepts, that of transparency and that of sensitive data. Sensitive data, it's problematic. Maybe we should speak about sensitive use, because your posts on Facebook, we can study them to try to predict depression. So what is it the data or is it the purpose? And for the transparency, that I think there is really a need to think about transparency for whom and how many layers do we need, because people need to rely on expert knowledge to, if transparency is to be of any role. So who is the transparency for?
That's the how can I say, the $1 million. Yeah, the $1 million solution. From our point of view, data protection, it's the data subjects who should understand what's done with data. And that's how it should be oriented. Not sure to answer your question, but it's transparency for the data subject at the end, in case of personal data processing. So a
data subject-focused transparency paradigm, yes.
That's the focus of GDPR.
Okay. Okay. I think
take over. Thank you very much. Eric, the last question did indeed show one thing. We are just about coping with GDPR and how to apply it in practice. And we are overtaken now by the question, what do we do with AI? Have we found a regulatory approach that is sufficient? I think the panel has nicely shown we need to start finding answers quickly, because the AI engine is under full steam. We don't have the final answers yet, but I think we did give some good guidance thanks to the speakers today. Thank you for your questions. There is two problems why we have to finish. One is lunch. And the other is, Sophie in 't Veld and the Privacy Platform has a very relevant panel here now on Cloud Act and e-evidence. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you next year when we come back to CPTB. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, guys. Well done. Well done.